My name is Greg Peterson, and I am the chairman of the Jamestown Bar Association Memorial Committee, and I'd like to call a special meeting to celebrate the life of Paul Webb. As I mentioned, we are filming. Please turn off your cell phones. The order of the day is going to be like this. First, I'm going to go off agenda just a little bit and talk a little bit about another attorney who passed away who was not a member of the Jamestown Bar. And then I will read the obituary. We will show an excerpt of an interview I did late last year with Paul. Then I'll open up the floor for comments in this order. It'll be the audience here at the Carl Kappa Theater first for comments, and when you do so, please identify yourself, and especially if able, come to the podium. If not, we'll come to you. Then we'll go to our Zoom audience, and it looks like a few are checking in, if they have any comments, and then I'm going to offer up a few remarks to the family members. And by the way, I just want to acknowledge the significant number of family members of Paul's who are here. Thank you very much for coming. This is special for us, but hopefully it's special for you as well as the law firm staff who shut down. So we're thinking of closing at 11:30 today at Erickson, Webb, and Skolton. Forget it. Ain't going to happen. They're all here. So that's the order of the day. I do want to pause and just a moment of silence because we lost a dear colleague of ours, Ron Zott, who was 62, of Dunkirk, passed away unexpectedly at home Thursday, September 9th, 2021. He was born December 16th, 1958 in Dunkirk, and he attended St. Hedwig's Elementary School, graduated in 1976 from Cardinal Mindszenty. He then attended Notre Dame University and graduated with honors in 1980 with a degree in law and government. He received his Juris Doctor from Syracuse University in 1982, subsequently worked as a law clerk for Walter Dragg and as an attorney in several law firms over the years, including Matar in Buffalo and David Civilette in Dunkirk. He also held positions in the Dunkirk City Hall as city clerk, city attorney for several Dunkirk mayors, and he also served Chautauqua County legislator for several years and had recently been working as an attorney in the Chautauqua County Family Court System, together with his own private practice. So I'd like to just have a moment of silence in memory of Ron Zott. Thank you. Now, in order to commence the celebration of life of Paul V. Webb Jr., I'd like to read excerpts from the obituary. And it's an extensive one, and I commend you your reading of it that appeared in the Post-Journal. Paul V. Webb Jr., 74, passed away September 15th, 2021 at St. Vincent Hospital in Erie, Pennsylvania. A dedicated and loving husband, father, and grandfather, he was born October 29, 1946, in Westfield, New York, the son of the late Paul V. Webb Sr. and the late Nadine Webb. He was a graduate of Gannon University, Syracuse University College of Law, and a practicing attorney for 49 years. Paul was a managing partner at the law firm of Erickson, Webb, Skolton, and Haidu, and an active member of his community. He loved the law. It was his passion, and he commonly said he retired when he started practicing law. He maintained the highest rating for ethics and ability for over 25 years and was named an upstate New York super lawyer for general litigation. Over his career, he served on the House of Delegates for the New York Bar Association, was a member of the 4th Department Attorney Grievance Committee, and was president of the Jamestown Bar Association. Paul additionally served as town attorney for the towns of Carroll, Kyneton, Poland, and the village of Bemis Point. He was also a fire commissioner for the town of Carroll for many years and helped establish the Rails to Trails section in Mayville, named after his parents, Paul and Nadine Webb. Paul partnered with his wife Judy to start and run Victorian Christmas and Candy House store for over 13 years in Lakewood. Paul and Judy raised their family in Frewsburg for over 20 years, where Paul was proud to serve on the Frewsburg Central School Board and, most importantly, coach Moore's Hardware Little League team. Paul was a dedicated husband, father, and grandfather to his 8 grandchildren, who he loved dearly. He is survived by his wife of 55 years, the love of his life and high school sweetheart, Judy Webb of Mayville, his 4 children, Daryl, Paul, Robert, and Holly, and his 8 grandchildren, all of which are listed in the obituary. I would like to now turn over the portion to a kind of a 10-minute excerpt of what is an hour-and-a-half long interview with Paul that we did in December. And I also commend you, if you want to see the full Paul Webb story and some of the excerpts and stories and war stories of his practice, feel free to do so. But I thought this 10 minutes sort of gave us a good sense of it. Were you destined to be a lawyer?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
It was, I probably became a lawyer because I couldn't find a job doing anything else that I liked. I actually, after I got through college, I went back. I was working with my dad in business in Mayville, and we were at, that was in 1966, and we started to, we were building what's now the captain's table. Mm-hmm. And so that was a big project in a small town, Mayville, and we didn't have any money, and everybody had to, do everything from, you would be tending bar in the winter and run back and cook the meal and take it out. But anyways, during that period, there were a number of lawyers that would, come in. That one was George Rogers from Mayville, who was our first public defender, and they would come. And Lee Town Adams was a friend of George's, and gradually they were talking. They kept telling me that I should get out of here and try to go to law school, and so eventually that's what I did. But I first had to find out that I didn't like the restaurant business, and I certainly didn't want to do that the rest of my life. So I couldn't find a job doing anything else, so that seemed to be the course of least resistance. So they kind of talked me into applying, and I went to Syracuse, and I ended up eventually back here in Jamestown with Phil, mm-hmm. and which was Phil Erickson, which was a real big break for me, really. When I started law school, I was married. I had a child at that time, and then my second son was Paul, was born, who's now a lawyer with us when I was at Syracuse, and my wife was pregnant for our third child my senior year, and so that made things interesting, and we didn't want to. I was fortunate. I did fairly well in law school. I was on law review, and I had some decent job offers at that time, which I think back of of, I think I had an offer for $12,000, I think, which was a good amount of money in 1960s, or it would have been 1972, 1971. But I had worked for Phil during the summer, and I really, because I had, my family and everything, we wanted to come back to Jamestown area, and he offered me the opportunity to come in with him, and I said yes. I had no idea what I was even going to make. I never even asked him, what and came back, and it worked out fine.
Now, at the time, was it Erickson and Erickson? Was Phil started with his dad, right?
It started with his dad, and his dad had just died a year or two earlier. Alton, right? And he had a guy by the name of Dick Reed, so it was Erickson and Reed when I came back.
Okay.
And Dick was, so it was the three of us, and so it worked out good. And then Dick finally, he was there a couple of years, and then he went back into the Navy. He was, and he actually stayed in the Navy and for the next 30 years, I believe. So it worked out good. We were in the Wellman building. Spoto was right down the hall from us. Jeff Weezy was in there. Mark Conley, Al Olson, Bob Booty. Adams, when I was trying cases, when he was on the bench, he used to actually, during the break, come down off the bench and come over to me and say, "Paul, why did you ask that question? That's a stupid question. You're going down the wrong path on this one, And so that always made me really feel really good, right during the trial to have him make any comments, but we got along fine. I first met Leetown when I was a kid, and we had a grocery store down the street from us. A guy named Poot Morris operated the store, and he was a avid Cleveland Indians fan, and I was a Yankee fan, and we used to go over there and argue baseball all the time. I was, as I said, a young kid, and he owned the store. Well, right across the street from him, there was a woman, and they had a dog, and it was a German Shepherd, and the dog had one of the neighborhood kids on the ground right out in front of the store, and was biting him, and Poot ran out with a fire extinguisher and whacked the dog, and the woman next door was Betty Kay. She was a big woman, about 6'2", and she came storming over into the store and got in a confrontation with Morse, and he shoving match, and he shoved her, and she went through the window of the store, and they arrested him for assault, and Lee represented him, and I remember sitting up in the trial. I went up to, I don't know how old I was, but Lee asked him about how he, what he did with the with Betty Kay, how he defended himself, and he said, he shoved her, and he said, "What, did you throw her out just like a bag of feed?" Poot says, "Just like a bag of feed." I threw her right through the window. They acquitted her anyways. They acquitted him. I actually miss, fighting with people like Dick Slater over stupid things like visitation for dogs and things that don't make any sense, but people like Slater like to fight about them, and so I did too. Well, then after Dick left, it was Erickson and Webb, and then Lyle came with us, Lyle Hoydu, and
Bruce came in before that, didn't he?
oh, Bruce, excuse me. Yes, Bruce came in shortly after I did. I think I started with Phil in 1972, and I was admitted in February of '73. And Bruce, I think, started with us in maybe '76, somewhere around in there, '77. And then after Bruce, Lyle came with us, and then my son. And so we were. I've been really blessed. I think that I'm one of those people that I can't. I just been extremely lucky throughout my life, really. I said I met my wife when we were teenagers and going to school. We've been married 50-some years, and had 4, great kids. I was lucky, though they say that that some of the decisions you make in life are who you marry is a very important one, and who you go into business with. The nicest part about being a lawyer that you can help people. You can draw their wills, do their estate. You have to get them divorced, help them when they're in trouble, help them. I mean, that's the story of our life, right? It's helping people, and so that's a big joy.
Like I mentioned, the entire hour-and-a-half long one is up on YouTube, and there are some vignettes, some of which are funny, just like the Judge Adams vignette. I would like to then now open this up to the public at large, starting first with the auditorium, folks. And before you get started, Lyle, I'm going to ask Ned, because I know he's got a little time constraint, and then Lyle, you're next. So Ned, if you want to come up. And please introduce yourself, and thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning. My name's Ned Barone, and I was blessed with the opportunity to have a chance to meet Paul early on in my career when I came back to Jamestown. And Paul had started practicing a few years ahead of me, but he was part of that generation of attorneys here locally that it wasn't difficult as a young attorney being able to admire someone like Paul. When I first met Paul, he was what I thought of as an attorney. I watched him in court. At the time, I was working for Ed Fagan, and for those of you who practiced with Ed or knew Ed or had the opportunity to fight against Ed, there's one thing that I learned, and he was an outstanding litigator. Well, so was Paul, and I had the opportunity to see Paul in court, and what I admired about Paul was that he seemed to get it. He was in the courtroom, and I had the chance to see someone truly advocating for his client. And I think that beyond that, one of the things that, if you looked at him, he was always, well, he would present himself well. If you looked at Paul Webb, he would be someone you would think of as an attorney. He was very professional. He was meticulous. He was intelligent. He knew the law. He advocated well. He looked forward to being in that courtroom and arguing. And that's what I admired, is his desire to get out there and fight. And as a young attorney, there was a few attorneys in the area like that. And as a matter of fact, when I came in, I had a chance to see a lot of those attorneys here today that I haven't seen, unfortunately, for a lot of years. One of them is, of course, is Neil Robinson and John Plum. And when I thought of Paul Webb, who was an outstanding litigator, I thought of John Plum. And I've told his son Paul this several times, but there was a few guys that you would practice against. And there's one thing that always stood out was being able to take them at their word. If they told you something, you could take it to the bank. You didn't need it in writing. You didn't need a witness. You didn't have to sweat it out. You didn't have to worry about it. If they told you something, that was gospel. John Plum was one of them. Paul was one of them. Neil Robinson, who was a district attorney at the time, was another one. There were several. And I had the chance to go out on my own with Howard Crosley, which was a whole nother experience. And Neil was in the Wellman building at the time, and we actually had a lot of fun. And God bless him, Tripp Price was there at the time, and it was a different world back then. And the clip that you saw that Greg put together, I think, was most appropriate, because what I admired about Paul Webb was not only his ability to represent people and advocate in a truly good way, but he was a regular guy. He was approachable. He wasn't pretentious. And as a young guy coming back here, I had a chance to sit down with him. And he was someone I really looked up to and admired and emulated, and for a lot of different things. But what most stood out, that he just seemed like a regular person. You could sit down and talk with him about anything, and you felt comfortable. And I think, he got it. And he told me once early on, this isn't just about being a good lawyer. And this is true. And I've tried to go by this all these years. It's about being a good person. That's really what it is. And it's about helping people. Like you saw in the clip, I thought that was most appropriate. Beyond anything else was, I think that deep down he truly wanted to help people. And that's what it's about. It's giving back to the community. And Paul got that. And I see the same things in his son, Paul. And when you see attorneys like that, like Paul Webb, they stand out. There's something different about them, but it's about the whole person. And so for a lot of us in my generation, we truly were blessed to have attorneys we could look up to, like Paul Webb. And he'll be missed not only by the legal community, but by the community as a whole. And I tell this to the young attorneys I bring into the PD office. And Paul told me this once, and this was years ago, I don't know, 35 years ago. He told me, part of your job, and I use the same expression today, part of your job as an attorney, as an advocate, someone who's helping someone, is to get in the way. That's what your job was. Paul got it. And he would get in the way. But more importantly, he did it the right way. He was a good man. He truly was. And I'm going to miss him. And I certainly know that his family will miss him. And I extend my deepest sympathy to Paul. I had the chance to meet Rob today, and I know that he'll be missed. But Paul, thanks very much for everything, and we're all going to miss you. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Lyle?
Good morning. I'm Lyle Hoydu, And I had the good fortune to find my way into a law firm with attorneys Phil Erickson, Bruce Skolton, and Paul Webb. Three gentlemen, very intelligent, hardworking, setting a very high standard for the practice of law. Paul, in particular, was unique. Paul had the fight and the tenacity like attorney Chuck D'Angelo. And Paul would always represent the underdog, no matter how big the battle was. And oftentimes, he represented the underdog without ever getting paid. Paul also had an amazingly broad practice, like attorney Daryl Brodigan. Paul successfully prosecuted, as special prosecutor, felonies. He could turn around and successfully defend his clients who were accused of committing crimes. Paul successfully got money for people who were seriously injured, and he could turn around and defend others who were being sued for their negligence. In the morning, Paul could represent a client on a multi-million-dollar, very complicated asset purchase agreement, and then in the afternoon, he's down at the dog pound fighting to get a dog released for a client. That was the type of attorney that he was. Paul also had an ability to focus and to become an expert in a very narrow area of law, like my wife, Mary Hoydu. And I think of a case in particular, and the principle that was in dispute is the rule against perpetuities. I mean, that is not even an elephant or a pimple on the backside of the elephant. And yet, Paul started his research going back 400 years into England, coming forward into all the different various interpretations. And then at one point, he retained an expert, a college professor, so that he could adequately argue about the rule of perpetuity. Now, I just named three outstanding attorneys in our community, and I highlighted some of their best traits. And here we have all those traits, and they're unified with one attorney, Paul Webb. And I think that's why many people thought of Mr. Webb as the attorney's attorney. He would be the attorney that the other attorneys would call up when they had a difficult case or sometimes a difficult client and wanted to be able to pass that baton on to somebody to make sure that their client got representation. And that is probably the highest compliment that we can pay to him. Now, after 25 years of practicing with Mr. Webb, I learned that he had two passions. One was the law, and the other is his family. And today we're joined by his wife, Judy, his children, Daryl, Paul, Holly, and Robbie, along with their families and the grandchildren. And Paul loved his family. Paul was devoted to his family, and he was very proud of all of his children and all of his grandchildren. I can tell you that whenever I rode with your father, we had two stations on the radio. We either talked about work or we talked about his family. Go back and forth, work and family, work and family. That's how your dad was wired. And I know today that you have a heavy heart and you're feeling a great void in your lives. But let me tell you, and in particular, let me tell Paul's children and grandchildren that I'm a better attorney and a better person for having known and worked with your father. And that sentiment is shared by all the staff who's here today and many of the attorneys who are in this room. And I think the greatest tribute that I can make to Paul is really the greatest tribute that the children and the grandchildren can make which is you wake up, you work hard, and you strive to achieve the high standards that your father and your grandfather set for himself and he set for all of us. In closing, the staff reminded me that apparently today is Boss's Day. So how appropriate. Happy Boss's Day, Mr. Webb.
Thank you, Lyle. And while everybody, that was terrific, and while everybody's going to reset their thoughts, and I'll further ask people, I want to just interject a letter I just received. Greg, I'm particularly distraught over the reality that that a long-scheduled Gebby board retreat was already scheduled for Friday, October 15th, 2021, so he's unable to attend, but please read this. And then he sent me this, which was very small print, and then he hand-delivered this morning something, knowing my advanced age, a very large print, so I can read this. In memoriam, Paul V. Webb, Jr., October 15th, 2021. First and foremost, I want to again share with Paul's family my condolences on a life cut way too short and a loss that is difficult to fathom. I want you to know that I would have been at this memorial of the Jamestown Bar Association in person, but for the board retreat that I am required to attend. I have great confidence that those assembled and those who, like me, are submitting their thoughts in a letter will recount in detail many of the attributes that Paul displayed in an effort to capture his achievement as a husband, father, leader, and lawyer. Despite the significant capacity of these orders, all will fall short in our efforts, and that is, in fact, the best compliment that any of us could offer. I know that some will recount Paul's intellect, his capacity as a litigator, his tenacity, and many other characteristics that any of us would welcome as part of their epitaph. Each, in turn, will honor Paul as friends and colleagues, a small but important offering to his family and the collective memory of who Paul was to each of us, and I join in with them in these observations. However, I had a unique opportunity to come to know and admire Paul as an attorney and friend. Like Bruce Skolton, Paul took a chance on me when he gave me my first job as an attorney in 1987. Little did I know that with that job, he was offering me something much more valuable. Over 34 years of mentorship in what it truly means to be a man, a husband, a father, and community leader. When he was in his law office, Paul worked hard, with WJTM playing in the background and Jim Roselli keeping him up to date with his community. Paul would see an endless stream of clients, and each left knowing that their issue was now Paul's issue, and that he would see it through to the end. While he was in the courtroom in his classic Joseph A. Banks suit, Paul was a tenacious but respectful litigator. He was not afraid to press an issue, but never had the need of vulgarity or personal attack, and I am sure others will recount what it was like having Paul as an adversary. His commitment to a case is renowned, and his preparation was intense. One of his techniques was to practice his arguments on an issue any chance that presented itself. My locker at the Y was just a few steps from Paul, and it was a regular lunchtime occurrence where I would ask him an opening question, and he would try his whole argument on me for most of the pressing piece of litigation. Initially, I thought it was to get my opinion. How silly. He was looking for my response to the argument and to practice the delivery. He did this countless times before he made it in front of a judge or jury, and practice made perfect. There will never be any doubt that Paul loved the law as a practitioner and as our representative at our local bar association, the New York State Bar Association, and the Western New York Grievance Committee. His rating at the highest level possible for ethics for 25 years speaks volumes about how he conducted himself as an attorney. But he never let that love overshadow what he was most committed to. In my opinion, his example shines the brightest in his ability to separate the hours as an attorney from the many more hours he invested in his family and his community. We all could try to emulate that, since the all too common approach is to allow what we do as lawyers to define us. Not Paul. His first passion with his family, who he was so proud of, and welcomed the moments to tell me of the latest success that Judy had at her store or his children in their pursuits. He dedicated himself to coach and cheer all his children, whether on a sports field or serving their country. Paul did all this, providing me, and I am sure others, with an example to emulate, a benchmark to try to reach, and the encouragement to bring his friend, being his friend. Paul, you are missed, and I have work to do to catch up to your example. Signed, Gregory J. Edwards. Other members of the community? Your Honor, Jeff Piazza. And if there are others who, just for time's sake, if you want to kind of queue up here, that would be fine. You don't have to, but it'd be helpful.
Good morning. I sense a theme in what I'm about to say. It follows what we've heard so far. But I was very fortunate to know Paul, and I was able to get to know Paul in several different ways. I was able to know him as an advocate. Paul was a zealous advocate for his clients. Anyone who was on the opposite side of a case will agree with that. He knew the law, and he was always prepared. I also was fortunate enough to know him as a colleague. As a young attorney, I was the town attorney in Kyneton, and we had a cell tower case. And I'll never forget that case because I didn't know anything about cell towers, but I knew Paul Webb did. He had just argued a case that went up to the appellate division, so I called Paul. Thought he'd give me a little advice, maybe point me towards a case or two. But that's not what happened. In the middle of his day, he stopped what he was doing. He said, "Jeff, come up and see me." He spent an hour and a half with me in the middle of his day, and he gave me just a wealth of information. But more important than the information, he gave me his time. And you all know, in the middle of your busy day, what it takes to stop and to do that. And that left an indelible mark on me. And I told myself, I want to treat my colleagues, I want to treat other attorneys the way Paul treated me. And that's something I've tried to do. I tried to do throughout my career, and he was really, really influential to me in that respect. Now I also got to know Paul as a client. I was the town supervisor for the town of Kyneton for 10 years, and Paul was our town attorney. And I can say it was less stress to be his client than it was to be his adversary. I knew the town was in good hands. He knew the law. He was prepared. Any legal issue that came up, he was right on it. He always had everything well in hand, and I never had to worry. And for 10 years, I relied on Paul, and he never let me down once. And I also got to know Paul as a person. Now, you may not be able to tell this, but I used to go to the Y every day. And like Greg Edwards, my locker was close to Paul's as well. And there was a time when I saw Paul in his gym clothes more than I saw him in his suit. But just as Greg Edwards said, we would talk about the law, his family. I can tell you he argued just as well in his gym clothes as he did in his suit. So I had the privilege of knowing Paul in many different ways. And I can tell you this, our community has not only lost a fine attorney, but even more than that, we've lost a wonderful person. He will be missed. I know I'll miss him very much. Thank you.
Hi, Steve Cass. Paul Webb. He was a lawyer's lawyer, just like Lyle said. He was passionate about the law. He zealously represented his clients. That's an understatement, right? He was convicted on his position. What do I mean convicted? Well, you better get to him before he made up his mind, because once he did, he was set in his ways. I kind of commiserate with the Webb kids because my dad's the same way. When he makes up his mind, just like Paul did, might as well just forget it. So I'd say to my dad, Dad, any reason to discuss this any further? He'd say, nope, just like the Webbs. Met Paul in the 1970s when he was a statistician for the Frewsburg football team. Later, when I practiced law with Lucian, I was on the third floor of the Furniture Mart building, and Erickson, Webb, and Skolton was on the second floor with the young associate, Greg Edwards. I was always down there in the office, meeting with Greg, Paul, Skip, and Bruce. They had the best library, and so kind of before Westlaw, we would migrate to the best library. And every time I was in there doing research, Paul would stop in, and he wanted to make sure that I was doing a good job, and he wanted to discuss the facts, and wanted to discuss the law, and he wanted to know if there was anything he could do to help, because he just ate, slept, and breathed the law. He was always helping and always learning. I used to love to say that Paul got his sense of reasonableness and his ability to compromise from Skip Erickson. And the reason I say that is because one time I think that Lucian closed a real estate deal and he was 1 penny short, and Skip made him write out a check for a penny and mail it to Skip. But Paul helped me with my first trip to the appellate division. I brought my brief to him. He fixed it. He corrected it, helped me with the argument. I had many, many cases with him, and he was one of the few lawyers in the state that could try anything competently, from a murder trial to a medical malpractice to a town zoning case, try it, take it to the appellate division, Court of Appeals, back down, try it again, and I think maybe with the town of Carroll, back up a couple more times, back again, and try it all over again. He was just incredible. I want to share just a few stories. Now that he's passed, the secret to dealing with Paul Webb is, if you're a lawyer on the other side, if you fought him, he wouldn't move an inch. But if you ask him for help, he was always there. Paul, if you can get me this much, I can settle it. He could do it if he thought that he would help and it would get it done. If you tried to fight him, pack a lunch, baby. Just like Greg Edwards said, he always presented his entire case. And Greg and I would always laugh about that. We'd say, hey, Paul, what's the status of this case? Well, you got the entire case. Facts, procedural history, legal points. It was like starting a train on a track. And we loved it. And we really admired his ability to not just only present an issue, but the entire case from start to stop. And once you started it, you might as well just sit down and listen, because you couldn't stop him. He gave the whole case from there to the end. Speaking of trains, Paul really was like a train, a legal train. His son, Paul III, said, my dad does not have the ability to go over things or around things. If he comes to a swamp, he builds a bridge. Comes to a brick wall, he just keeps ramming it until he goes through. Lastly, excuse me, I tried a case with Paul. I was the judge. I think we tried it for 27 days. It was against Joan Adams. And one day in Chambers, I'm sure you've heard this story. Anyways, one day in Chambers, Joan Adams says, Paul, I sent you that in a letter. You know I sent you that in a letter. Paul said, Joan, I don't read your letters anymore. I just wad them up and throw them in the trash. And the reason I laugh is last week, Joan was there and I told that story to Joan Adams, and Joan said, yep, it's true. But then Joan, went on to say that Paul was probably the best practitioner she had ever faced. She had the most respect for Paul Webb out of anybody. That's really quite a compliment. Yeah, Paul was a lawyer's lawyer, and I'll give you a greater compliment. He was really just a great human being and a wonderful person. I think of him like a friend and a father. I'll miss him.
Thank you, Judge. Anybody else from our audience? John?
Good morning. John Plum. It's hard to follow those last remarks of Steve's. I just want to take a moment to extend my condolences to Paul's family, to the members of his firm. He'll definitely be missed. All of us that have known him over the years, we all know what a great legal mind he had, what a great attorney he was. He and I started out just about the same time here in Jamestown. My first dealing with him was on a commercial arbitration matter, and right away I was struck by what a good attorney Paul Webb was. I have two or three other more personal stories. For 20 years I had the honor of being the school attorney of Frewsburg, and during most of that time Paul was on the school board. So I got to work not only with him but for him, and my appreciation of his skills and of his abilities were just magnified by that experience. He was just a really good school board member, and it was really pleasant dealing with him. We both had children serve in the military. Paul would go out of his way to call me out of the blue to see how my son might be doing when he was in Kuwait or out on a sub, or my kids in the Air Force. Likewise, whenever we'd have our conversations, I'd always ask about his boys in the Army and how they were doing. And whether it was up at the courtroom, walking downtown over to City Hall, or maybe seeing him running up by the cemetery on an afternoon, he'd always stop and we'd talk about our kids and their military and experiences and how they were doing. And I appreciated the fact that Paul would go out of his way to do that. And then one other connection is that during the late 80s, we both had daughters playing on high school basketball teams. I believe Holly is in the audience here. She would play for Frewsburg. My daughters would play for Randolph. 2 or 3 times a year, Paul and Judy and Marie and I would find ourselves on opposite sides of the basketball courts, giving one another a thumbs up or thumbs down, depending upon who made a basket, who made a foul. We'd always talk about the games afterwards, sometimes in the hallways, sometimes the next day he'd call me up. Somewhere along the lines, my 2 daughters got a reputation of committing a number of fouls. Paul would always point that out to me. And somewhere along the lines, they got the nickname, 2 of them were playing together, the nickname of Whack and Hack. And to this day, I have this suspicion that it was Paul that gave him that nickname, because he would always have this grin on his face when he'd bring it up, and then there was that sort of a quirky laugh he had. It would always follow any reference to, he'd call my girls the Whack and Hack kids. And it just reinforced for me how much his family meant to him. And it was an honor to know Paul. He will be missed by this entire legal community. And I extend my condolences to his family. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, John. Others? Andy?
Andy Goodell. Others have said that Paul was a lawyer's lawyer. Paul was this lawyer's lawyer. About 25 years ago, I went through a divorce. For those who have gone through that process, it can be very difficult and painful. And as a lawyer, of course, I thought it might represent myself and my colleagues, and my friends said only a fool would do that. But as a lawyer, I knew who would be the best lawyer for me to go to, and I went to Paul. And after we discussed my case for a few minutes, he said, well, what do you really want? And I told him. He called me up that afternoon and said, it's agreed. And for those of you who have gone through a difficult situation, to have your lawyer solve it for you quickly and effectively is a huge blessing. Now, like many of you, I've been on both sides with Paul. I had a case, Paul was representing the town of Carroll, I think. My client got a DEC permit to operate a gravel pit. Unfortunately, it was in an area that was not authorized under the town zoning law. And apparently the town thought their zoning law applied. Well, I won because the language of the environmental conservation law said it preempted local zoning. And Paul had the audacity to appeal. And on appeal, he won. And I took it up to the Court of Appeals because it was obvious he was wrong. And to my great chagrin, the Court of Appeals, I think it was unanimous, agreed with Paul. And as others said, there's more to Paul than just his advocacy. He was also compassionate, had great humor, and as Judge Cass noted, if he can help you, he will. So I had the difficult responsibility of calling my client and telling him we lost on appeal, that I was still hopeful he would pay my legal fee. And he said, well, what's that mean? I said, you got to shut down. He says, well, there's two ways to do it. I can take a dozer at the top of the hill and push it down to the required slope, but that'll leave the bottom of the slope right on the edge of a protected trout stream, or I can start from where I am and go up until we have the proper slope. And I said, well, what would the DEC want? And he said, they want me to go up. And I said, get an approved DEC closure plan, which he did. And a few weeks later, I got a very nice call from Paul. Andy, you remember this case? Yeah, like I'm up to the Court of Appeals all the time and losing. And he goes, you lost. I go, yeah. He says, but gravel trucks are still going out of the gravel pit. I go, yeah, I know. We're closing down. And I explained the situation, and he just laughed. And the amazing thing is, before my client could finish the reclamation, the town changed the zoning law to allow him to continue. And you know that Paul's fingerprints were on that. I had one other opportunity, well, many other opportunities, but one in particular where I was on the same side of Paul. That was a lot more fun. And we had an adversary who had hired one of those very expensive law firms from out of town. And you probably have met those attorneys. They charge 2 or 3 times more than we do, and they think they know 2 to 3 times more than we do. And it was fun to watch Paul educate them. And yes, that was another case that Paul won, this time on the local level and on appeal. There's one last aspect, and you saw it in the video. Paul had a great sense of humor. And last year, I was extraordinarily frustrated with the Office of Court Administration, OCA. And I shared that frustration with Paul, and we thereafter exchanged some emails, which Paul III reminded me of, with all of our suggestions on what OCA actually stands for. And I will share with you, the first letter didn't stand for office. But you can think of all the other adjectives that might start with the letter O, and Paul and I explored them all. So, as one of Paul's clients, as one of his colleagues, and as one of his adversaries, he left an indelible mark in our community and with the legal profession and with me personally. Deeply miss Paul. God bless the opportunity that we had to work with him.
Thank you, Andy. Anybody else? Chuck? Chuck, as you recall, was the tenacious one that Lyle referred to.
As I put in my hearing aids, as I slowly age into this practice, my wife of 44 years, Mrs., said to me right after she learned that Paul had passed, my wife said to me, I'm sorry, Chuck, I know how much he meant to you. And that kind of puts everything in perspective. You know, we all have levels of love and appreciation for people you work with. I had a very special relationship with your husband. He meant the world to me, he means the world to me, and he'll always be important in my life. Because everybody's done a great job at telling you about the personal feelings they have for him, I'm going to segue, because I'm always the boring guy, like Paul. We talk about the substance and the law. So I looked up Paul's list of cases. He's got 55 reported appellate level cases. I don't think there's anybody in this room that's even close to that. I started with Paul when Phil and Paul asked me to act as co-counsel because they had two clients. They needed to have somebody else represent the other client to avoid any potential argument on conflicts. I got interviewed by Paul, and then I got taught by Paul how to practice law when I first got back from where I practiced before. And I knew Paul would always dig. He'd know the case law cold. He went out of his way to make sure that he knew what happened in the year 400 on rule against perpetuities. Just a sharp cookie. But when I started to look at the cases, what he did different than most lawyers is he could take on any case on any subject and be proficient in arguing it. So just in summary form, because we've been here a while and I don't want to hold the family up, I do want to, for the lawyer's benefit, because I think they'll get a kick out of it, I want to tell you the kinds of cases he did. Right of first refusal, rule against perpetuities, of course, antenuptial agreements. These are all litigated at the appellate level. Eminent domain, real estate covenants, intervention motion on a motion to intervene at an appellate level. He's making law all the time. He was not a guy that was just taking existing case law and applying it. He was making law in these areas. Homeowners association standing in a lawsuit, breach of contract, individual liability of corporate officers, employment discrimination, election law, ADR, right to appeal, alternate dispute resolution for those that don't do that work, family-wise. Partition actions, trespass action, validity of a will, easement rights, motor vehicle negligence issue regarding proximate cause, and a jury charge. He litigated to the appellate level a jury charge on proximate cause. The lawyers in the room will tell you, most of us don't do that kind of work. He was very, very unique and very, very, very smart. Malicious prosecution, attorney fees for preclusion. He moved on admission of evidence at trial issues multiple times. He moved on stays of proceedings, assessment and taxation. Those of us that did DWIs 30 years ago know about this case that Paul did a great job on. It was on the drawing of blood and vehicular manslaughter cases. And in my love of area, he litigated a number of civil service law dismissal cases. Paul Webb has the standing case 30 years later on what's sufficient to terminate a public employee in the state of New York. It's Paul Webb's case for the whole state. You know, one of the things that we saw on the tape that was unique about Paul is he was not in your face kind of guy when he talked with you. But when he got rolling and he gets that smile on his face, it's the best. It always was the best. It'll always be the best. I learned a lot from Paul Webb. I don't think I'll ever be as good a lawyer as Paul Webb, and I want to tell you that's okay with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. Anyone else? Arthur? Stay with us, Zoom folks. We'll be with you.
For the record that we have here, thankfully, this has been a tradition of the bar that I personally am so proud of, and I'm very conscious of the time I'm omitting 80–90% of what I wanted to say about Paul because it is so typical of what was said before. My first remark is that I've been a member of this bar for 61 years, and I had just started in a law firm when I came to Jamestown of Van Vleck, Goodell, and McKee. And early on, there came a time when this memorial for a fallen lawyer occurred, and we were in that office. And Charlie was there only one day a month to transfer over the several cases that he had had that were still pending when he was in Congress. In fact, he was in Congress then. But he still, as a member of the Jamestown Bar, gave me a strong finger and say, you, come on over to that memorial service with Al McKee and I did. And I honestly cannot recall the member, but I do recall the immense emotion that I felt as a 25 and a half or 6-year-old lawyer, whatever I was, with the fact that the court stenographer that I had seen the day before up in Mayville was making a transcript which was going to be sent to all the family members. And that touched me then. It touches me today. And I'm asking each and every one of you how important it is. This transcript is going to be one of the best ever in all the 61 years because the subject is one of the best ever for the past 61 years. And imagine what the family and generations to come, as you talk about the grandchildren, what about the fact, as Charlie Goodell said to me, I never gave a thought to old age, just like every one of the other lawyers. You do not think in terms of what it's going to be like when that day comes for you. And I have lectured to bar associations all over the country for American trial lawyers when we were trying to accomplish something new for plaintiffs that started in California, and we wanted it to apply nationwide. And in a moment, I'll tell you one of those great principles, which has to do with bad faith against insurance companies. Paul Webb turned out to be one of the nation's most prominent cases in that field when we eventually did get California concepts adopted in New York. But I want to go back to the importance of this concept. Other bar associations do not do this. I only found one or two out of dozens, and they were Midwestern, rural, I think, states. It is a tradition of this bar that we can never give up. And today's program is probably a more important impression on each of you that we have to hold this for future generations. God knows what's going to happen when Greg Peterson gives up the chairmanship of this JBA Memorial Committee. And all of us should be thinking now of who can fill those shoes. But as far as Paul, my personal relationship with him started before he was a lawyer. Right after I had first come to town, one of my only good and big clients was a man named Norval Reed in Sherman that owned a business called Norval Reed and Sons in the agricultural auction field. And he rented out Webb's captain's table every year for the Reed and Sons Christmas party. And I attended with great pride, and I'll never forget when Norval Reed, a man much taller than I, introduced me to the bartender at Webb's, or maitre d', and he said, "Arthur, meet your competition in the future, because I think he is going to be a great lawyer. His father and I are best friends." And I met Paul Webb first when that happened. And later in time, it evolved that he did become that great lawyer. And my final thoughts are, as a senior member of the bar, I'm now very conscious of the reasons why this tradition has continued unbroken. They are the same reasons that Charlie Goodell and Al McKee told me then, and that is, there's coming a day when your colleagues are going to have and should have a ceremony about you. And what will it be like when it's your time? And we cannot allow this. I think I'm going to get from Greg one of the tapes of this one, just because I have become reborn again about how important it is, and I want this one. Now, Paul Webb, I was never one of the close personal friends like many of the other speakers, but like every other member of the bar, and let's be now in this moment, on this day, about all of us have wondered or desired when we first started out. We wanted to be secretly, even though we all deny it's a big deal with us, we wanted to be well liked by our colleagues. We also wanted to be considered very smart, very excellent ability as a lawyer. And even going back to law school, I think, I like to say it in other speeches, every honest lawyer who's honest to himself will admit that there were days when, in the back of the class, he would close his eyes and replay on the back of his eyelids a tape about how he would have written the great consents and so on. And everybody has desired to be respected for whatever he accomplished. And I beg forgiveness to every woman attorney in this bar, in this room, and in the future, because I am so old that I still use the wrong personal pronoun. But let me say, when I say he, I'm talking about all lawyers. And it's important that we preserve this. I also think that there is a little bit of Atticus Finch in every one of us. And for those too young to remember it, Atticus Finch was the lawyer that Gregory Peck played in To Kill a Mockingbird. There's a little bit of that in all of us. And all of us thought, could I get to be a great judge? Like some of the great judges, and I'll leave it at that, fill in your own blanks. But as far as Paul's case, he was as comfortable in a justice court as he was in a court of appeals, and vice versa. And I would like to cover 2 or 3 of those cases that Chuck D'Angelo mentioned, because there's a great story behind every one of them. And when Paul Webb changed the bad faith law in the Court of Appeals, when a snowplow got caught on the railroad tracks in the town of Poland, in the village of Kennedy. And I talked with Paul about what kind of a chance do you think you have? And he said, I don't know, except I'm personally convinced that the law is wrong and it has to change. And think of the intellectual strength that a lawyer must have to go all the way to the Court of Appeals to get the law on a small area changed forever so far. And that's how Paul looked at everything. I used to joke about Paul and John Goodell going to the Court of Appeals about a loud muffler case in Jamestown City Court. It defies imagination. Now, I don't know whether it's the Atticus Finch genes or any other genes that move you, but think of the beauty of this tape this day, going to grandchildren yet unborn, and think about it in relation to yourself and other current members. And I wish you would indulge me longer, but all I can say is, it is not enough to say Paul Webb was a lawyer's lawyer. It is to say that all lawyers should adopt something from this memorial and Paul Webb's history. And I'm so proud to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Other comments from the live audience? Steve?
Stephen Abdallah. I just have a few brief remarks. My father, James Abdallah, passed away 11 years ago, and he was mostly a transactional and estate lawyer, and late in his career had a very stressful, nasty case involving an estate, and that went into litigation. And he was able to just pick up the phone and call Paul and see if he would assist him on the case, be co-counsel. And I don't know how Paul found the time to do all the things that he did, but he came in on that case, and as everyone's speaking here, just was a fighter, and it just helped, my dad immeasurably. And then secondly, I guess maybe putting on my county attorney hat, Paul and his town representations, which I'm guessing probably were not always the most lucrative representations, but just showed a commitment, to the public and local government in the community. And certainly, my God, the greatest example is this town of Carroll case that remains ongoing, involving this corporation that's trying to build a C&D landfill in the town of Carroll. I mean, Paul has just been amazing in just not letting that fight go, and I'm sure that the residents of the town of Carroll, I will say the whole county, are just so appreciative of that effort. I mean, a local attorney just giving it all, going to bat for his community. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Anyone else from the theater here? If not, we're going to then, anybody who is on Zoom, plug. Okay, and raise your hand and we'll let you go. And while we're doing that, as we were talking about Atticus Finch, remind me of a little vignette. We had a CLE at the Jackson Center dealing with Attica. And as we were doing so, in between the break, little did I realize that Paul Webb at the University of Syracuse Law School, they were asking for volunteers to go to the Attica prison to interview the prisoners regarding potential rights that had been violated. He raised his hand, and he had that experience of going to the Attica prison shortly after the Attica prison riot. Who knew? Who knew? There's actually a picture floating around of him telling me that story. With those on Zoom and anybody raising their hands, or how would we know? So if you could turn your mic on and camera, if anybody would like to speak, we'll give you just there's Judge Claire.
And he was so honorable and willing to extend himself to do the right thing. I believe these things have already been said. We had some very memorable moments in some of our trials, and if this wasn't so long, I would share some of them. When I left the practice of law to go to Mayville, there were two attorneys that I chose to refer my cases to, and Paul was one of them. It was very important to me that I refer my clients to someone who I thought would serve their interests well and that I could trust, and he certainly fit the bill. Paul always did his homework and was prepared. When we had trials together, I always enjoyed the challenge. And again, as a judge, having the experience of really having to be on your toes due to the combination of his just not ever giving up, his intellectual strengths and trial skills, and knowledge of the law. I always looked forward to dealing with him. He was always respectful, and one of the things that I appreciated the most about Paul was that he shared my vision of family court, and he was willing to extend himself for it. Paul stepped up at the very beginning when I first was considering running for family court, and I always appreciated that about him. I only have the utmost respect and admiration, and I feel that I was a better attorney and judge for knowing him. I extend my condolences to the family. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I'd like to offer the opportunity to the family members of Paul III and Robert. I believe you want to have some comments. And while they come on up, and while you come up, just an observation, and this is for Judy, and Judy alone. We've never, ever had a crowd like this for a memorial service. Doesn't exist. And when you see the number there, so aside from those people who are in person, add the Zoom numbers, this is an incredible compliment to your husband. And for those, part of the family, never seen the like of it. And so kudos for everybody here. You speak volumes by your attendance, not only in person, but via the Zoom. Look at the numbers. It's unbelievable. This is incredible. So with that.
Good morning, I'm Robert Webb, I'm Paul's son. Try to keep my head in a happy spot. I want to thank Mr. Peterson for doing that video that we watched at the beginning. I'd watched that video before in its entirety. But watching just the small clips again, there were things that resonated with me, that I picked out that I hadn't honed in on before. And I think in the years to come, I think every time I watch that, there will be something new that I will take from it. So happy. But just to reinforce the importance of that, I think that's a really good thing for all of us in learning and sharing and picking out things that can help us in life. Get it back here just a second. And one of the things I took from that video that resonated with me was the influence that each of us have on each other. So you saw, my dad said there at the beginning how he became a lawyer was kind of by accident, which he said, and he recognized that he was lucky. And we don't always all of us find what we want to do in life. My dad did that, and by accident, kind of, but it was a perfect fit. He really loved the law. He would love to be here today. I think this is my first time in this room, and I'm sure he would love to be in here. Just the room itself feels very lawyery to me. The chairs and the whole ambiance in here. I think he would love that. He really, really loved the law. So just like he became a lawyer because some lawyers came in the restaurant, partly, and I think the part that wasn't told there is he knew he didn't want to work for my grandpa, who wasn't the easiest to work with. It's not always easy to work for your dad, as my brother also knows. That can be challenging. But we have an influence, and the words that were said in here today by everyone influenced us, and I think it's important to have a place like this. Everybody gets together and shares those. And I'll just tell one quick story. I don't know if there's really a point to this story, but it came to my mind that I thought this audience might enjoy. When I was a kid, we went to D.C. for vacation, and we went to the FBI building in D.C., the headquarters, the Hoover building. And I was probably 12 years old. And so we're standing in line. Then this is pre-9/11. So we're standing in line to take a tour of the FBI building. They would do a little tour. And my dad had a murder trial going on at the time. So, of course, as you know, he's always thinking about work. No matter what he's doing, he's got, as a professional that he was always thinking, how can I use this in my profession? And I think he kind of approached everything in that really professional way, whether it was being with the family. He looked at everything as a job. I need to do these things, and he worked at it. He worked at everything. But we're in line to go to the FBI little tour, and he starts talking with somebody. I don't know exactly how it happened, because I was pretty young at the time. But the next thing we know, he has an FBI forensic examiner taking us up into the FBI laboratory, which at that time was inside the Hoover building. And he had an FBI examiner talk through. I remember, I have a distinct memory of some guy showing us like hair fibers in a laboratory setting. And he was explaining how they examine hair fibers, and he was able to acquire some expertise from there that he did use at trial. He got a contact, just kind of a neat story. And then when you contrast that with what has happened today and after 9/11, that would never, ever happen. I can tell you that just getting into the FBI building, the thought of just some random defense attorney walking up and talking to someone and them saying, come on into the building, we'll tell you all about examining hair fibers. That would not happen any longer. So that was kind of a neat moment in time that he was able to garner those expertise. But lastly, again, I just want to thank everyone for being here. The words spoken here today are really nice to hear and helpful. And this whole process, and Mr. Peterson for doing this, is really, really a good thing, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul Webb the third, in the office, to identify me, I'm P3, so that was the identification which they came up with early on. But just to reiterate what Rob said, thank you. We just really appreciate everyone showing up and saying a lot of nice things. It's very cathartic to hear that. I just wanted to point out that, my dad, like we already said, he had a real passion for the law. And I was just going to say that on his last day in the office, he was on a phone conference with Sue Reed, who was a retired Court of Appeals judge. And he was conferencing a case with her. And that conference had been set up. I remember a few weeks earlier, my dad had saw me and said, hey, he said, Gene Piggott called me. And because Gene Piggott, the Court of Appeals judge, and my dad were kind of close. Gene had a son who went to West Point, so we had that connection. He goes, Gene Piggott called me and wanted me at a conference, a case with Sue Reed, who was a former Court of Appeals judge. He goes, he wants me to do a regular phone conference and go over stuff. And he was all, pumped up over that. And I thought, geez, that's my dad's world and my world a little different in terms of what, stuff we're working on. But that day, he had a brain bleed on May 6th in his office, and then we worked with him for months, in case anyone doesn't know, and unfortunately, it just didn't turn out the way we wanted. But his last day in the office on May 6th, he just finished that phone conference, and he, with Sue Reed, it was set up by Judge Piggott, and they were going over a pending case that he had in the Court of Appeals. It's Lyle's going to argue now, so good luck, Lyle. And but what, I would joke before, I would say, if you told my dad he had one day left to live, he might want to finish a brief. I don't know, and I would half joke about that. And but that day, that was what better to my dad. I mean, what better thing would you want to be doing? He's talking with a former Court of Appeals judge, had been set up by this, and he's got his case in the Court of Appeals, and that was what he was doing that day. But like we already said, my dad was a grinder, and he worked, that's how he did things. And he, like we've already talked about, my dad didn't know the definition of a brief. It wasn't brief. It never was. It was always, it had to be 50 pages or it wasn't a brief. And, he was, as he already said, above all else, he just enjoyed helping people and working things out. And I would say lastly, and I've said this to Greg already, I appreciate him making that video, and it was kind of a weird, not a weird thing, but in February of this year, sometime around there, my dad saw me in the office on his way out, and he says, hey, Greg Peterson did this interview with me in December. He goes, I'll show it to you. He took me up, and he was all, excited about that. He took me up in his office and he started to play it and showed me a bit, and it bothered me, because I said, geez, Dad, that's great, but, that's end of career life. We're not, I'm like, I don't want to know about that. I don't want to see this video. But so at the time it bothered me, and my dad was, I'm sure he thought he could practice, like Tom Brady. He practiced law until he's 90 years old and be around. I'm sure that's what was on his mind. And so at the time, I didn't want to think about him not being here, but you never know. And now here we are, and we're so appreciative that Greg, just by chance, I guess, happened to do that interview with him in December and set that up, and so we have that, and that means the world to us, just as much as it means the world to hear all the comments today, and it's very, like I said, comforting to the entire family. So thank you, everybody, for being here and participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everybody, for attending today's celebration of life. And it was, in fact, a celebration of the life of Paul V. Webb, Jr. To the family members, hopefully you may have learned something. To the staff of Erickson, Webb, Skolt, and Haidu, thank you for all attending, and certainly for all the members of the bar, current and past, who've attended. By the way, Judy, there's a lot of judicial figures here. Obviously, there's nothing happening in court today in honor and in memory of of that. I won't call them all out, but I'm looking at all of them right there. It's like a who's who, and most importantly, the most important guy, Jerry Leineke, of every court system, is sitting right in the middle. And to draw him here is a major league event. So a lot of kudos for the memory of Paul Webb. We'll draw closure now, and as we do, we'll make a copy of this transcript. Judy will provide that to you so you can share with the family. This session is broadcast and will be on YouTube. And so that'll be available to pass along to other family members. And since there is no other business, we stand adjourned.